Hey, and welcome back to another video. So in today's video, we're going to look at StateObject in SwiftUI. So we're going to discuss what it is and why you'd want to use it. So let's get straight into it. So when working with our SwiftUI views, we may want our own custom source of truth where our views can read data, manage, and also write to it as well as reacting to changes. So in my previous video, breaking down SwiftUI state and data flow, and also using observable object and at publish to build a source of truth in SwiftUI, I break this down even more, so you should check them out. So what StateObject allows us to do is it allows us to have a single instance of our source of truth so that our views can reference and read from them. So you may have seen instances of observable objects being created with the observed object property wrapper, but I'd argue against using this since it's possible that your source of truth gets recreated / re-rendered, causing you to lose data and have an invalid state. You only really want to use the observed object property wrapper if you have to support SwiftUI in like iOS 13. So in this example, we're going to simulate logging into an app, and this will allow us to see how we can read, write, and bind and react to changes from our source of truth using StateObject. So in order to simulate a login screen, we're going to have a login view, which will allow you to import a username and password, and we're going to have a screen that tells you that you've logged in. So first off, let's build our login view. So I'm just going to create a new file. It's a SwiftUI view, and we're going to call this login view. So within our login view, I'm just going to add in some UI that, simulates a login form. So let's do this now. Cool. And if I just zoom in now, so let's actually look at our code here. So we have a VStack, and on the VStack, we set the text field style for all the text fields to be a rounded border, which is why they have a border around them if you look at it. So the first one that we have is a text field which has username. So this text property here, it actually expects a binding, but because we've not got to that bit yet, we're just using the constant property to just give it some kind of default value. And then we also have a prompt, as you can see here. Now for the password, we're not using a text field, we're instead using a secure field. And the reason why that is because you don't actually want someone to be able to see their password. So we're hiding the ability to see this by using a secure field. And it's the exact same as text field in terms of the text and the prompt properties. And then we have a button here, which we're going to use to simulate our login. And then we just apply some padding around our VStack to push, this in. So if we actually run this on a simulator, and just start typing nonsense in here, you'll see that we can see the text in the text field, but on our password field, it's actually hidden because we're using a secure field. So in order to learn more about bindings as well, I actually do have a video called Passing Data Between Views with @binding in SwiftUI that you should check out. So now that we have our login view, let's actually build our logged in view, which is just going to be a view with a button that allows you to simulate logging out. So I'm just going to create a new SwiftUI file by using the Command N keyboard shortcut, and then we're going to select SwiftUI view, and then we're going to call this logged in view. Cool. And within our logged in view, it's just going to be a VStack with some text and a button. So let's add this in now. Cool. So now we have a text on the screen that tells us that we're now logged in, and we have a button which we'll use later to simulate logging out. So what we need to do now is we need to actually build our source of truth that our views will actually read from. What we need to do now is actually look at how we need to architect our app that we're trying to simulate someone logging in. So we need properties to actually store the user's input, validate it, and also toggle if they're logged in or not. So let's actually build our source of truth, and we'll call it login view model, which will handle logging someone in. So let's create a new SwiftUI file, and we'll call this login view model. And then I'm just going to type out the basis. All right, cool. So this is just empty example of our source of truth. So you'll notice that I've actually marked this with the observable object protocol. Now, the reason why you need to mark it with this is because we're actually going to be using the state object property wrapper, which allows us to create a source of truth that we can actually listen to changes and actually read values and properties and also write to as well. So in order to use the state object property wrapper, you need to make sure that you're using a class and also your class is marked with observable object, or else it won't work. One thing that I've also done as well is I've actually marked this class with the keyword final as well. So what we're going to do is we actually need to capture the input from our login view. So we actually need some kind of model. Now for this model, I'm going to use a struct. So let's do that now. So notice how the struct has vars and it also has a default value. So the reason why we use vars is because we want to actually bind this to our text field so it can write to it. And we've actually set it to empty strings because initially when the app launches, those text fields are going to be empty. So there's actually not a value for it. So it's empty. So we don't actually need classes as well because we don't need to keep a reference of this user around. We just need something to bind and write to. So a struct will be fine. And also as well, what we need to do now is actually add in a publish property for capturing the user's input, and we'll initialize it with just the empty values like you can see here. So let's do that now. So now we also need a property for simulating someone logging in, and also as well if a user has logged in or not. So let's add these in now as well also. So these are going to be booleans that we add in. Cool. So these are our source of truths that our views are going to read from. So we're going to be able to read from and write to the user here, and we're going to also be able to read if it is and if someone has logged in. So what we need to do now is we need to actually create a function that simulates someone logging in, and we'll also do some basic validation. So I'm just going to type this out now and then break it down. So we have our function here called login, and what we're using here is a guard statement. So the way a guard statement works, if you're new to seeing this, is that unless the condition is met, it will not actually carry on. So if the username is not empty and the password is not empty, then we'll allow the application to continue on to line 28 and set its loading is equal to true. But if either one of these conditions is not met, so if it is empty, then we're going to hit the return block here and it will actually return and stop execution. But if everything's okay and both the input for the username and password isn't empty, then we're going to set is loading to true here, and then we're going to simulate an API call. So we're going to add a delay in using the dispatch queue, and then we're going to set is loading to false to simulate that it's finished logging you in. So we got a response from our API, and we're going to set is logged into true. So now we know that someone has logged in. So we need a function for handling logging out users as well. So let's add in a new function for logging users out. So I'm just going to type this out now. Cool. And this function just simply sets is logged in now to false to simulate you being logged out. So now our source of truth actually has everything that it needs, and it has functions and properties that we can actually read and write to. So let's actually create an instance of this source of truth within our content view. So we can do this by using the StateObject property wrapper, like I said before. So let's do that now. So we go into our content view. Let's create an instance of, and you also want to mark this as private, since similar to state, which I break down in state in SwiftUI, which you should also check out. This is the view source of truth. So now that we have our source of truth in this view that its children can read, write, and bind to, let's look at how we can actually bind the user's input to this. So in our login view, the purpose of that view was to bind the user's input and tell us when someone has tapped the button. So I actually don't want the view to have full access to this login view model for this example. I mean, you could give it access to the whole login view model, which we will look into in another video. But we actually just want to create a binding between the input that someone has typed in and the content view. So in our login view, let's create a binding property that will allow us to bind the user input from our content view, which is our parent, to the login view, which is our child. So in login view, let's create that. Cool. So now we should actually get an error within our SwiftUI preview because we need to actually inject a binding into it. So to fix this, we're just gonna create a constant and just give it an empty user. See now that we don't actually have our error anymore. So now what we want to do is actually bind our text field and secure field to the user that gets passed into this view. So rather than us using a constant here like we have done on here, we actually want to use this and use the $sign and the properties that we need access to. So let's do that now. So like I said before, notice how we have to use the $sign to access the binding. So this will allow our text field to read the value from this property and also write to it, since the text fields automatically update the values of it via bindings. We can actually see this in action by checking out our user's value has changed by using the onChange modifier within this view. So let's actually use that, and we'll see how our model is being updated based on the binding that we pass in. So in order to actually use the onChange modifier, we actually need to make sure that our model that we want to listen to changes to is actually equatable, and structs are not equatable by default. So let's go to our user and we'll add in and use the equatable protocol like so. So the reason why we need to do this is because the onChange modifier compares to see if a change has happened to the model. So has a change happened to either one of these two properties? And if it does, then it will fire the change. Now, in some cases, you may actually have to use the actual protocol functions for the equatable protocol. But because we're using strings here, Swift is able to automatically detect the changes for us and handle the implementation from the protocol. So we don't actually need to write the function that comes with this protocol. It'll just handle it for us. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to add our onChange modifier to our login view and actually print out changes to the model. So let's do that now. Cool. So notice here that we're saying that onChange of user, and we're not using a $sign here because this doesn't accept a binding. It does check it accepts an equatable object, so we don't need to use a $sign. It gives us the new value that has been updated, so the new value that represents a change, and we're just simply going to print this out into the console. Now we actually need to use our login view to actually see this change happening. So let's actually add our login view to our content view so we can actually see this being printed out to the console. So let's go into our content view, and rather than having our text here, I'm just going to use our login view, and we're going to need to inject our user into our initializer. So we're going to access our user from our view model. So what this allows us to do is it allows us to create a binding between our login view model and our login view by using the dollar symbol. So any changes that now get made within our login view will automatically be updated within our login view model. So when you're working with SwiftUI previews, it doesn't actually print out to the console, so we can't actually see our changes within the SwiftUI preview. So we need to actually run this on a simulator. So let's run this now. And within our simulator that you can see on the right hand side, I'm just going to start typing. And as you can see, as I'm typing, the console is actually printing out what I'm entering. So if I just type in anything, you'll see that our model is being changed and it's being updated and printed out to the console. So now that we know that that's working, what we actually want to do now is we actually want our login view to perform some kind of action when someone taps on the login button. But like I said before, I don't actually want the login view to actually have a direct link to our login view model. I just want this login view to be dumb, and when it taps the button, it just tells me that, hey, this button was tapped. And we want to approach it this way, where we don't want our view to have access to our view model. We can actually use closures. So what this will allow us to do is it will allow us to actually communicate an action from our login view. So when our button has been tapped. So let's actually add this in now to our login view. So if we go in here, we'll add a closure after our binding called did tap, like so. And then within our button, we'll call the did tapped closure. So this will now report to us when someone has tapped the button. And if you scroll down, you'll notice that you have an error here. That's because now our login view has a closure for listening to actions. And in order to fix this, all we need to do is just simply add in the curly braces like so. And if we go back to our content view, you'll notice that we should also have an error as well if we build it. As you can see, we have an error now. So in order to fix this, all we need to do is just add in the curly braces like so. So now, whenever someone taps on that button, our closure is going to get fired, and we can actually call some kind of like function or perform some kind of logic within this closure. So we need to actually call the function to simulate logging someone in. So in here, let's say vm.login, and this will simulate the login functionality. So to run this now, nothing would actually happen because we're not actually using our has logged in property in our login view model to actually, change our view. So we've done bindings with our text, and we've also done writing too, but we've not actually read from our state object. So we actually need to show our loading dialog and change between the two views when a user logs in and out. So we need to actually read our logged in property to do so. So let's actually add a conditional to do this within our content view. So I'm just going to type this out now. So this is valid, and let's actually just go through this. So we're saying that if the view model is loading, then we want to show a progress view, or else we want to show if the view model is logged in, we want to show the login view, or else we want to show the logged in view. And this is valid, and it would work fine, but it's not really readable. And we can actually make this more readable by actually using enum, so it's actually clearer in terms of what the purpose of our current state is. So what we're going to do is actually add an enum to our view model called current state, and we'll actually give it some cases to actually describe the actions of what's actually going on. Let's go into our login view model, and let's declare an enum in here called current state. And then we'll actually add in a case. So within our enum, we have three possible states that our view model can be in. So it could be loading, and if it is loading, then we'll handle that. It could also be not logged in, so someone's not logged in, so you see your login screen, or someone could be logged in. So what we need to do now is we actually need to remove our published properties that we were using for handling whether someone has been logged in and if the application is still loading. So these two published properties can actually go now, and instead what we want to do is we actually want to have a published property called current state, which tells us the current state of our view model when we're performing some kind of action. So let's add that in now. So for our published properties default value, I've actually set this to not logged in. And the reason why that is because when you open up the application for the first time, you're not actually logged in. Now, I'm not doing any kind of like session handling in this. And if you were, then you'd obviously want to set this to something else. But for this example, it's quite simple. You're just simply not logged in. But you'll notice now that we actually do have quite a few errors because we've deleted our published properties that we were using to read and write to. So instead of using is loading is equal to true here, I'm actually going to set the current state to loading here. And inside of our dispatch queue.main, because we want to simulate someone has now logged in successfully, we're going to set our current state to logged in. So let's update that now. And finally, when someone is trying to log out, well, we want to set that someone has not logged in. So let's change that now. So you can see here, compared to before now, when you're actually working and using these enums and changing the state of our published property, it's a lot more readable when you're trying to see what's actually going on. So I'd highly advise if you have a view that needs to change based on some kind of states that you consider using an enum rather than having loads of published properties that are true or false with booleans. So what we need to do now is actually go back to our content view and actually update it based on the current state of our login view model. So let's go back And rather than us having an if statement, I'm just going to refactor this to use a switch statement. So let's do that now. Cool. And you can see here on first glance, when you look at it, this also is more readable as well. So depending on the current state, if it's loading, we're going to show the progress view. If you're not logged in, then we're going to show our login view. And if you are logged in, then we're going to show our logged in view. So let's actually run this now and see what happens. So I'm just going to run this on the simulator. So you can just see that it's also updating as well. You could run this on the SwiftUI preview if you wanted to. So if we was to just write in any kind of username and any kind of password, you'll notice that it actually logs us in. You can see our loading spinner, and it now tells us that, hey, you're now logged in. So if we tap log out, nothing's actually happening, and we're going to get to that in a second. But if I actually try and run this again from the start, and if I actually tap login, you'll notice that nothing's happening because both of these text fields are empty. But again, if I just type in here, shows us progress spinner, and it tells us that, hey, you're now logged in. So what we want to do now is we actually want to apply the same kind of logic and thinking that we use within our login view, where our logged in view actually has a closure to tell us when this button has been tapped. So let's go into our logged in view and we'll give it a closure again called did tap. And we'll call our closure did tap within our button again. And we'll also fix the errors here. So we actually could do this, and this is valid, but because we're not actually passing in any properties via the initializer, we actually don't really need it. So we actually could just do this as well. And if we go back to our logged in view, rather than us having our initializer, we're going to just remove that because we're not passing anything into it. And instead, we're just going to call our closure, which tells us when someone has logged in. So when someone's tapped that button and is trying to log out, I should say, actually. So now let's actually call our logout function like so. Cool. So now let's actually test out the whole flow. So we'll try to log in without entering anything, and you'll see here it doesn't work. If I enter one, I leave the password empty, it still doesn't work. But if I just put in any nonsense in here, it now logs us in successfully, and we get a simulated view, and we're now told that, hey, you're now logged in. So it shows us our login view. And if we tap log out, you can see that actually takes us back to our login screen. But one more thing that I actually want to do is that you'll notice that when we actually logged out, the details that we used to log in were actually still persisted. Now, you probably don't want to do this because you want to actually make sure that someone actually types in their username and password just for security reasons. So what we actually want to do is that when someone logs out, we actually want to clear our input, because right now, our view model still has the values that were bound to our text field. And you can see here that it's actually reading what's in our user struct here. So what we're going to do now is on our user, we're actually going to create a function within our struct to actually reset these properties. So because it's a struct, we need to actually use the mutating keyword to say that we want to change this reference to this struct. So let's add in the mutating keyword. So now what we're saying in this function called reset is we're now clearing the username and the password, and we're setting that to empty strings. So it just clears the values that were within these properties. And what we want to do now is within our logout function, we actually want to call that function on user. So we want to say self.user.reset. So now whenever we call this reset, the text fields that are bound to this user property will be clear and won't show the previous value that someone has entered in. So let's go back to our content view and we'll just run this again. So we'll just hit resume to run it. And on our username, we'll just type in our username. On our password, we'll just type in a password, and then we'll hit the login button to log in. And then you'll see now that we've logged in fine, and then we'll log out. And as you can see, when we log out now, both the text fields are now cleared because we're actually resetting the value within our user. So we've done that successfully, where we've managed to simulate someone logging in and logging out, and also clearing any values that someone previously had. So that's everything in this video. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really love it if you gave me some feedback in the comment section below. Also as well, if you haven't already, then hit the like button by giving this video a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that as well. And if you haven't already, then subscribe to the channel by hitting the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can get updates whenever I release a new video. That's everything from me. I'll catch you all in a bit. Deuces.